Hello students, we will continue our discussion on the collective security system as mentioned under the United Nations Charter. In the last lecture, we basically discussed what is collective security system all about, what is its history, how it was incorporated in the League of Nations, what are its major assumptions, how it was different from the balance of power system. So, these issues we have already covered. So, now let us focus our attention on the operation of collective security provisions by the United Nations. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which dealt with collective security provisions from Article 39 to 51, was for the first time applied during the Korean War when North Korea attacked South Korea in June 1950. The Security Council in an urgent meeting called for immediate military measures to deal with North Korea and requested all the members of the United Nations to make available their armed forces for the assistance of South Korea to a unified command under the United States. So, United States were the main country under whose guidance, under whose leadership it was decided to form a multinational force that can deal with the problem of North Korea's aggression against South Korea. However, only 15 countries besides the United States, they sent their combat forces to Korea, and for most of the part, it was the United States that brought the war cost, and the war ended in a stalemate when the Chinese troops they were fighting on behalf of North Korea with Soviet made weapons. So, with the entry of China, war ended in a stalemate, and the North Korea and the South Korea they remained divided, and a ceasefire was immediately declared between the two countries. However, this collective enforcement action was made possible mainly because of the absence of Soviet Union from the United Nations Security Council, because at that time China was excluded from the UN Security Council and even the United Nations system because of the communist revolution in that country in 1948. So, that was the reason why China was not there, and the Soviet Union protested this this American activity, because it was mainly the Americans who expelled China from the United Nations, and this was strongly protested by Soviet Union, and that was the reason it was not present at that time in the UN Security Council, and that kind of absence from the UN Security Council helped the America to pass necessary resolutions to form a multinational coalition to deal with the aggression made by North Korea. The Korean military enterprise under the UN flag is basically considered in Western countries as the first example of collective security action against an aggressor undertaken by the organized community of nations. However, the military action was not taken by the international community, although the forces fought in the name of the community, although the UN force was in fact the United States force viewed basically as an anti-communist alliance rather than a neutral or universal world security system. So, there are a lot of questions with about the US involvement in the Korean issue, because the Americans were basically concerned about the expansion of communist ideology in countries like Korea, and that was the reason that it decided to support South Korea in its effort to retain its political independence and sovereignty and to stop communism in the southern part of Korea. Another example of collective security can basically be found during the Gulf War of 1990-91. When Iraq annexed Kuwait in August 1990, the Security Council, acting with great promptitude and cohesion than any other time since the Korean War, determined that the invasion constituted a breach of international peace and security, and authorized the deployment of military forces to stop the aggression of Iraq. So, the point is right from 1950, this is the second time when you find the collective security action on the part of the United Nations and that was to deal with Iraq's aggression against Kuwait. The United States mobilized military forces against Iraq under what it called Operation Desert Storm, and basically it was joined by many other countries including some prominent Arab nations. Iraq finally surrendered, and terms of a permanent ceasefire was worked out by the Security Council. So, here you will find that a multinational force was mobilized quickly, and the Americans they provided the leadership, and not just some western countries, rather few countries from Arab world, they also joined hands with America to deal with Saddam Hussein's attack or Iraq's attack against Kuwait. Iraq finally surrendered, and the terms of a permanent ceasefire were worked out by the Security Council. So, this war ended in a kind of solution that Iraq was forced to withdraw from Kuwait, and Kuwait finally got its independence and sovereignty. And this is for the second time you can find the operation of the collective security system under the United Nations. However, the United Nations did not authorize the use of the United Nations flag, nor did it grant a unified command of forces as it did in Korea. So, the Korean situation was different because the Chinese were involved in the case of North Korea, but here you find that it was only Iraq, and it was not supported by anyone because it violated the sovereignty and political independence of another independent country. But the most remarkable aspect of these actions was not just that the Soviet Union did not boycott the Security Council meeting, rather as it did in the Korean case, but no permanent member of the Security Council used its veto power to prevent the Council from acting. So, there are two differences you can say that in case of the Korean conflict and the Iraq annexation of Kuwait. Here you find that in the Korean conflict the Chinese were directly involved with North Korea, but here in case of Iraq, Iraq was alone, no other country supported Iraq in its war efforts, in its annexation of Kuwait. Secondly, you find that all the countries they were present in the UN Security Council, and they have not used veto power because the Soviet Union was about to collapse, and the Chinese were not opposed to the formation of multinational forces under the United States leadership to deal with the aggression by Iraq. So, this is for the first time you can find all the major powers, they were on a common ground that Iraq did a wrong thing with Kuwait, and there is a need to deal with the situation by pooling all the resources of under the United Nations. Now, the question is whether the United States was truly committed for the collective security principles as mentioned in the UN Charter, or it had any other vital interest. The point is like the Korean conflict, America had a lot of important interest in Kuwait, and both are similar in the sense that at that time America was interested, it was just the beginning of the Cold War. So, America was interested to stop the expansion of communism to different parts of the world, and that was the major reason why it played an important role in mobilizing global resources, mobilizing the resources along with other countries to deal with the Korean conflict. Similarly, when Iraq attacked Kuwait, America feared that that would lead to monopoly over the oil resources in the Gulf, and Iraq would be in a position to dictate the supply and prices of the oil, and at that time America was highly dependent on the Gulf oil, and that was the reason that it decided to teach Iraq and Saddam Hussein a lesson and forced Iraq to withdraw its forces from Kuwait. There is a joke that had Kuwait produced beetroots and carrots instead of oil, had Americans still supported Kuwait? So, that is the question, and you can understand the difference between the Korean conflict and Gulf War. There are similarities, there are differences, but the interesting point is that these are the only two events in the history of the United Nations when the principle of collective security actually operated under the United Nations. We have already discussed how the oil interest of United States in the Gulf region was important for its economic development, and that was the major reason why it decided to support Kuwait in its efforts to get its political independence and sovereignty. Now let us discuss about the problems and limitations of the working of collective security provisions under the United Nations. Now it is important to ask why the United Nations collective security system was invoked only twice in its history. There are so many reasons for that. First, the capacity of the United Nations to enforce a system of collective security is severely limited by the fact that it is essentially a creature of its members. So, if you look at the structure of the United Nations, it can only do that thing that is allowed by the members of the United Nations. So, it does not have its own personality, or it cannot do anything beyond that is acceptable to its members, particularly to the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Second, the effectiveness of collective security system greatly depends on states sharing the view that peace is indivisible. Aggression against any state is meant to trigger the same kind of behavior among its members, regardless of the fact that where it takes place and the identity of the aggressor and the victim. So, if you carefully look at the provisions of collective security system or collective security provisions, you will find that all members. So, the effectiveness of the collective security system is based on the belief that everybody considers peace as important, and whenever there is a violation of peace by any member of international community, every member state is expected to follow the same kind of policies or act under the charters of the United Nations equally. So, there is no discrimination, there is no problem to deal with the situation. So, the effectiveness of the UN collective security system is basically dependent on the fact that all the members states believe in the necessity of peace, and if there is a violation of peace in any part of the world or with any members of the international community or the member of the United Nations, all states are expected to behave in the similar way to deal with the situation or to deter the aggression. But there is a problem in the sense that there is always a tension between the national interest of individual countries and the collective security obligations, because these are considered as the real problems in the successful working of the collective security system under the United Nations. States may not be willing to name a particular state as an aggressor and go to war, but there is a problem. There is always a tension between the national interest of individual states and the collective security obligations under the United Nations. So, there is always a problem. Now, if the aggressor is your friend, if the aggressor is your ally, then you take a different position, and if the aggressor is not related to you, sometimes you do not show any interest in dealing with the situation. Third, collective security has certain instrumental, or what you can say, UN Charter limitations. It permits the states the right to self-defense, and this legalizes aggression or war in self-defense. It also lets governments to form regional security pacts and organizations. So, any state can claim what it has done against another member of the international community is dictated by its self-defense. So, any member of the United Nations can attack another member and say what it did was demanded or was required under its right to self-defense. So, how you define the situation that whether what Russia did was for its self-interest, or what Ukraine did that was for its self-interest. So, how you define right to self-defense in the Russia-Ukraine war or the Hamas-Israel war? So, both parties in two different situations, they can justify their war in the name of right to self-defense. So, this is again another problem that has created a lot of practical difficulties for the operation of collective security under the United Nations system. Fourth, despite its apparent simplicity, the term aggression is notoriously difficult to define, and the problem is there is a conflict of interest and differences among the states, and that makes the determination of the aggressor as a difficult task in a crisis situation. So, how you say who is the aggressor and who is the victim if the situation is very different and there is always a conflict of interest and differences among the states. Pakistan always says that it is the victim of terrorism, and but we know that it is not a victim because it has created its self created monster that has affected it for a long period of time. So, how you define yourself as a victim or yourself as an aggressor, that is very difficult. And for countries like China, China will never say Pakistan has committed any kind of aggression if it starts a war with India. So, the problem is every country looks at the issue of aggression from its own perspective, because it always evaluates everything in terms of its national interest, and that is the reason why there is always a problem of defining aggression in international relations, and that is the reason why collective security has its own limitations. Fifth, the concept of collective security is deeply conservative because it is dedicated to the maintenance of territorial status quo. Identifying aggression as the worst crime in international relations, and it assumes that peaceful mechanisms of territorial change exist that make the war unnecessary. The problem is these are all idealistic positions, because you can't maintain territorial status quo always, because the nations are always in search of opportunities to increase their territory, as we can see in case of Israel and Hamas. The problem is everybody agrees with aggression, and aggression is not something good, everybody accept that, but the issue is you cannot always have a peaceful mechanism for territorial change, because war is always inevitable, war is always possible. Everybody thought that interstate war has become outdated in the post Cold War period, in the first 2 decades of the new millennium, but as the case of Russia and Ukraine shows, as the case of Hamas and Israel shows, as the case of many other interstate war that occurred since the end of the Cold War shows, that war is a possibility and you cannot stop it, and because of politics, because of your self interest, you always interpret the situation as per your convenience, as per your need. If you expect that all the states will think in the same way or cooperate in the same way, then definitely you are overestimating something, or you are definitely thinking something better of the human nature or better of the selfish states. So, that is again a problem under collective security. Sixth, the Cold War ensured that in most issues the United States and the Soviet Union, that you can say the permanent 2 members of the UN Security Council, they always adopted opposing positions which prevented the successful operation of the United Nations Security Council. So, most of the time you find that if something is proposed by one superpower, that was opposed by the other superpower. So, that in a way paralyzed the working of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council. This was compounded by 2 other factors. First, the use by the permanent members of the Security Council of their veto power dramatically reduced the number of threats to international peace and security or incidents of aggression when it came to the Security Council for action. So, before the Security Council taking any concrete action on any issue, so that was vetoed by one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So, that was the reason why most of the issues did not come to the consideration of the Security Council. Second, despite the provisions in the UN Charter for setting up of a military staff committee as a subsidiary body of the UN Security Council, resistance among the permanent members of the UN Security Council actually prevented the UN from developing its own military capacity. So, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, they have always opposed the establishment of the military staff committee, and that is the reason why the United Nations, the Security Council always depended on the powerful countries for collective security provisions. This has meant when the United Nations has authorized military action, so it has either been subcontracted, as we have seen in case of the United States, which led the multinational forces such as in Korea or in Gulf War, or to regional bodies such as the NATO or the African Union, or it has been carried out by the multinational force of the so called blue helmets through its peacekeeping operations contributed by the member countries. So, when you do not have your own military capability, so definitely you have to outsource the issue, outsource the problem to some other country, and it is none other than the most powerful countries of that time, and that is the reason we can see how the United States was the main country that was instrumental in forming the multinational forces to deal with the North Korean aggression or the Iraqi aggression. So, the point is either you do it on your own, just get the approval from the United Nations Security Council, and that is not very difficult to get. So, the issue is this is only one problem. The other problem is sometimes you outsource the issue to the regional actors such as NATO or the African Union, or even it is done in the name of United Nations peacekeeping force in different other parts of the world. So, in that shows the limitation of collective security, that also underscores the importance of United Nations having its own military capacity. Moreover, due to the lack of permanent peacekeepers, the decision to raise and deploying a peacekeeping force has always become slow, complex and hard. So, it is not just that you just outsource the problem or outsource some other countries to deal with the situation. Rather, when you do not have the permanent peacekeepers, when you decide to deal with a particular kind of situation, so that may need immediate kind of solution, but because you do not have the necessary military capability, so you are dependent on other members of the United Nations, and that takes a lot of time to gather the forces, or it is sometimes very slow, complex and hard. Consequently, the interval between the date of aggression and the date of UN intervention has provided the aggressor plenty of time to get the benefit and come away. Simply you just because it takes a lot of time to send the actual forces to the ground, so the aggressor can decide to take all the benefits and immediately or unilaterally decide to withdraw, and this is the problem. So, because it takes a lot of time to mobilize the forces, in that circumstances the aggressor can decide to take the benefit and unilaterally decide to come back. So, that is again another limitation of collective security provisions in the United Nations. Seventh, during the post Cold War period, the UN has been forced to confront a new range of problems and conflicts. These include the reluctance of the states whose security is no longer threatened by the earlier East-West rivalry to commit resources to the cause of collective security or for the defense of the states on the other side of the globe. So, because you are not affected by the earlier East-West conflict, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, so you think that it is not your problem, because the problem is happening to the other part of the world. So, you feel secure, you do not feel the need to contribute necessary forces or assistance to deal with the situation. We have plenty of examples. I can give you an interesting example here. When Russia attacked Ukraine, all countries in the Western Europe or the NATO members, they expected that India as a democratic country would support Ukraine, which is another democratic country, and it must join the European countries and the United States in imposing sanctions against Russia and also giving all kinds of military assistance to Ukraine to deal with the situation. You must have heard the statements by India's foreign minister Mr. Jaishankar, who said that Europe should come out the earlier mindset that European problems are global problems, and global problems are not European problems. So when India is dealing with a powerful China, which has mobilized its troops in the Indian border, and the Western countries, they have not even criticized that action. And if there is a war between India and China tomorrow, so India doesn't expect much from those countries because they have their own interest with China. So if you expect India to join with you, then definitely, so you should support India when it is in a very difficult situation. So so that shows the double standard. Your problems are others' problems and others' problems are not your problem. So again, that may be a different example, but the point is, every country thinks in terms of its national interest. If they are not directly affected, they don't think the necessity to mobilize the resources to deal with a particular kind of aggression or war. Eighth, the emergence of what is called a unipolar world order also threatened to sideline the United Nations the way it did in the Cold War period. The Iraq War of 2003 is the best example. The Iraq War in some ways demonstrated the emergence of the United States as the only superpower of the world, because it decided to go ahead with its plan to invade Iraq in 2003 despite the opposition by the United Nations. But despite this UN opposition, the Americans they went ahead with their plan to invade Iraq. So that shows how the unipolar movement was dangerous for the collective security provisions of the UN Security Council, and particularly the United Nations Security Council did not authorize the United States for its plan to attack Iraq in 2003, but despite the UN opposition, it went ahead because at that time there was no strong opposition by any other permanent member. Ninth, in the post Cold War situation, the UN view of international peace and security has also undergone tremendous changes. The threat to security are considered to emanate not only from aggression but also from civil wars, humanitarian emergencies, violation of global standards of human rights, and other conditions like poverty and inequality. So these are the what you can say non-military sources of security that is not being emphasized, and rather we understand security in a very traditional and in a very narrow perspective. So we have to understand the whole notion of security changing, and it is highly interconnected with development, human rights, justice, and other issues. So our understanding of security should not be just limited to military security, rather it should expand and it should include the non-military dimensions of security that is connected with development, that is connected with human rights and justice. In fact, the pandemic or the COVID-19 has created a normative environment for the Council members to rethink and broaden and deepen the collective security provisions of the United Nations beyond military conflict, to emphasize the Council role in addressing health issues, structural inequalities, and other human security threats. So as we have seen in case of COVID, so your perception of security should not be limited, should not be restricted, rather these are the issues, how the COVID, that has collapsed economies of the most of the countries, and if it affected your security, it affected your economy, it affected your social life. So your perception of security should be broader, should be wider, so that you cover these issues also under the provisions of collective security. 10th, the lack of reforms of the United Nations Security Council and the geographical spread of its permanent members also causes an imbalance in the role of the United Nations in the maintenance of global peace and security. So you may find that the United Nations, despite the attempt by several countries including India, Japan, Germany, from early 1990s, there has not been much progress in reforming the United Nations Security Council. So that clearly shows that the states are guided more by their national interest rather than the interest of global peace and security. The voices of small countries can be heard, but policies are not adopted in response to them unless they serve the interest of the great powers. The point is, the great powers will only undertake collective security actions if that suits their interest, if that situation demands their involvement, as we have seen in case of Korea, in case of Iraq. So, the point is these things can only be rectified, these things can only be corrected if there is a major reform in the United Nations system, particularly its Security Council. Finally, the continuation of NATO even after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the absence of Warsaw Pact, that also underscores the fact that how the collective security provisions of the United Nations they are failed, because in fact you can say that NATO itself is a cause for war, cause for conflict, as we have seen in case of Russia Ukraine war. So, the point is if you have a regional military organization that deals with the security problems in that particular region, that in a way restrict the operation of United Nations or the operation of its collective security provisions. So, let us end our discussion with some important points. We have already discussed the major limitations of the working of collective security provisions in the UN Charter. So, in this context there is a strong need to take necessary measures for reforming the United Nations system as a whole, particularly the operation of the Security Council, as it directly deals with and it is responsible for maintenance of international peace and security. The first is there is a need to enlarge the Security Council of the United Nations through different reforms, by undertaking different reforms, and as I said although there are lots of suggestions, there are lots of recommendations how to reform the United Nations Security Council, and how there is a consensus in different parts of the world about the inclusion of countries like India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, and maybe one or two important country from Africa, but the permanent members of the UN Security Council, especially China, it has acted in a very negative way, and as a result of which there is no major reform in the UN Security Council. So, if we want to make the collective security provisions really relevant, there is a need to have a kind of consensus among the permanent members of the UN Security Council. Without their consensus, it is not possible to have any kind of reform in the UN Security Council. Secondly, there is a need to suspend the veto in the event of mass casualties or atrocities. We have already discussed this issue, that how the frequent use of veto, frequent exercise of veto has actually paralyzed the UN Security Council and made the collective security provisions outdated, and if there is a any atrocity, there is any civil war, if there is any problem of genocide, so on these issues that provision should be made to automatically suspend the veto, because the big powers, the great powers, they have always interpreted the situation of their liking or disliking in terms of their national interest. Similarly, there is a need to improve the efficiency of the way Security Council functions, particularly focusing on its procedures and practices, because sometimes Security Council gets paralyzed because of its rigid procedures and practices. So, that there is a need to improve those kind of procedures and practices. Lastly, there is a need for stepping up the role and autonomous tools available to the Secretary General of the United Nations, because if there is a crisis and if this UN Security Council Secretary General wants to send a representative or special envoys to deal with the situation, he needs approval of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So, that again handicaps the Secretary General to deal with a particular kind of situation. So, these are the measures that we need to take about the improvement in the functioning of the collective security provisions in the UN Security Council. Only then they will function in a proper way. So, thank you very much for your patience and listening the lecture. Thank you very much.